This quotation is from Hélène Jourdain-Morange, the violinist who worked very closely with Ravel and the cellist Maurice Maréchal on the first performance of this sonata and the sonata for violin and piano. A rather rebarbative character at first meeting, the duo hides treasures, but it treats the violin rather harshly. The composer permits the instrument no charming, facile seduction. It is naked, the poor violin. Stripped of its halo of vibrations, it seems stripped of decent attire. The pure violin is not pleasant. It must hide the hardness of its open strings and the hollow of its chest under makeup. With the assistance of the artist, it becomes tender or passionate. Dare I call the violin a great courtesan? In the trio, Ravel gave the violin the most cat-like manner. Here he wanted it to be vindictive, whereas the cello is demonic. Ravel, who loved gambling, assigned it the most tenor-like tessitura, and our poor cello climbs the treble scales like a little squirrel. But all of this is the secret behind the scenes. Good work should give the impression of ease, of gay abandon. Perhaps the most striking part of that quotation is Jourdain-Morange's understanding of the almost paradoxical relationship between the sonata's effect, its expressive effect, and Ravel's coupling of a stripping away of certain kinds of expressive resources with the introduction of certain sorts of instrumental challenges. In fact, I think if you were to look at that quotation as a player, the first thing that surprises you is this is a very sophisticated piece of instrumental writing. So naked is not the first word I would have gone for. This is why we're starting from here. I don't feel her use of the word naked is just a poetic ploy. All of her writing is wonderfully, it's playful and serious at the same time. It's always poetic, and it's impossible to translate, so I apologize for what's there. This presentation is a constellation of perspectives on the role of the instruments in the performance of this sonata, with a view to pointing towards something that cannot be said, but can only be done. As Vladimir Yankelevich, who wrote one of the most important books on Ravel, as he wrote in the 1960s, the performer is similar to a lover in remaking the primordial act as if he or she were the first to do it, as if there had never been anyone before who had done so. The basic elements of Euclidean geometry are being reinvented, each respectively and in isolation, each for someone by himself personally. That's one of my favorite descriptions of what a performer does, of why each performance is different. Even very, very early in Ravel's life, his friend, the poet, who later called himself Tristan Klingsor, he obviously loved his Wagner, pointed out that Ravel was somebody obsessed with the surface of things. He wrote, "This ambitious dreamer liked to give an initial impression of being occupied with the surface of things." And it always recalls to me the Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde. It's only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. And at a superficial level, what Ravel does with this instrumental pairing, well, he does the obvious thing. He says to himself, the cello can play pretty well all the notes the violin can. We will use them through the same tessitura. And then we will make allowance for the fact that the cello can do things underneath that the violin can't. It's surprising how little of the repertoire for these two instruments makes that simple observation. But that is coupled to an astonishing level of compositional artifice, particularly, and I think this is where Jourdain-Morange is coming in with her idea of naked instruments, and it's wonderful to pick up Paul and Chris's talks now, because it's particularly in relation to open strings, shared resonances, and harmonics. And I think those two we could see as a revelation of surface or the kind of medium specificity. This is a piece that could only be written for these instruments, of which Clement Greenberg or Gotthold Lessing, choose your historical period if you want to decide who would approve of it. There's a lovely little quotation about Ravel's awareness of a paradoxical relationship between nature and artifice. Everyone would forever say, you know, everything's artificial, it's all mechanical, it's like a clock. The story is told by Calvo Caresi, who says that Ravel said to him one day, "Doesn't it ever occur to these people that I can be artificial by nature?" Which I like. the sonata has a special place in Ravel's output as perhaps one of the most extreme expressions of his love of challenge. This is one of the key sections in Jankiewicz's 1939 book, published just after Ravel died, where he's describing Ravel's technique. And he does it through a series of things that we wouldn't ordinarily see as technique. And I've assembled these, and they're out of order from the book. But Ravel's audacity expresses itself in two ways. Firstly, in a liking for difficulties overcome, and an obstinate search for effort. The tightrope metaphor comes up again and again in pieces of writing about Ravel, and it's one I know we've used, haven't we? You get on the tightrope and you stay on the tightrope. And secondly, in the spirit of artifice. Every composition by Ravel represents a certain problem to be solved, a game in which the player, and the player is of course both Ravel and us, voluntarily makes the rules of the game more complicated. Although nobody makes him do so, he places restrictions upon himself, etc. Some aspects of this poverty, through energy and tour de force, become more opulent than opulence. And we're going to come back to this in the idea of nakedness for the instruments. In the Sonata en Dur, Ravel undertakes to shape a whole symphony using only his thumb and first finger. I like quoting it. It's not really quite fair. There is a lot of resource here. And he compensates for the rarity of the notes and the poverty of the chords by the, and this is the critical bit, the mercurial mobility of the two parts, which manage to be everywhere at the same time. A tortuous badinage in which two voices in counterpoint pursue each other, catch each other, and lose each other again without the support of any accompaniment. And that accompaniment idea we'll come back to. A little bit of background quickly, because it's useful to have this to understand how and why the beginning works as it does. The first movement of this piece appeared published like that in the special memorial Debussy edition of La Revue Musicale, December 1920. We know from Morange's writing that Ravel had begun work on the piece back in March, and he began by writing to her saying, "Come over, I've got some work to do." There's a lot of interesting music in that volume commemorating Debussy, but I want to pick up what Ravel takes from Debussy here just very quickly. He actually, the ostinato with which this piece begins comes from a little passage towards the end of the second movement of the string quartet. Not an obvious quotation. In fact, I wonder even whether it's a quotation that other people pick up, because in all the literature on this piece, there doesn't seem to be a picking up. Maybe someone else has come across it, but no one comments on it. But if you're a cellist and you know this quartet, and of course this was the quartet on which Ravel modeled his own, it was a hugely important piece for him, and this movement in particular, because this movement consists of over 40 variations of the same thing. And this was the kind of game Ravel liked to play. We've got a recording here leading up to this section. And this is it now. So it's a little circling ostinato at the end of a movement, which seems a lovely way of paying homage to someone else, to build a new piece around it. I'm going to talk about some other music before we talk about this, because to understand what the relationship is between these two instruments, you need to set it in context of other sonata repertoire from the period, a little bit after in this case. A special sensitivity to the relationships between the instruments in sonata repertoire can be found in much of the French chamber music of the early 20th century. Even though we know Ravel wasn't especially fond of Debussy's late music, A special case for this is Debussy's Cello Sonata of 1915, in which there is almost no shared material between the two instruments. And coming from the repertoire we heard this morning, it's very interesting. There's always a kind of dialogue going on between the two instruments, in which there's material being passed from one to the other. Debussy doesn't pass the material. They're in a kind of parallel dialogue. And the other piece was one I referred to briefly in the previous talk I gave for the musical instrument in performance. Those three pieces from 1914 that Stravinsky wrote for string quartet. In the first of those, the four instruments all have completely individualized material, and no one pays any attention to anybody else. They just follow their material through. So Ravel is coming to writing a duo sonata in an environment in which we now have in play the dialogue between these. Nothing is taken for granted. Everything will be earned. The sonata form of the first movement here, which was the next and the last major chamber work Ravel wrote. He spent nearly 5 years writing the violin and piano sonata. That puts a nice spotlight on this, because through much of the exposition you have what you've got here. I'll play a little bit of a recording in a moment, but you've got a quite traditional 19th century, if I put it all in inverted commas, dialogue between the two instruments, where the piano plays something, the violin plays something, then the violin picks up something like the piano's material, all incredibly beautifully handled. And it's very difficult to see in detail from here, but it's interesting to note how differently he's articulated the violin writing, because he's trying to find some way of making sure that the violin has a kind of articulation that matches and is in close dialogue with the piano. So if I play just the beginning of this piece, this is Joseph Sigeti and Carlo Bussotti from a recording made in 1953. Throughout the exposition we have that kind of interplay. By the time we come to the recapitulation, though, Ravel does, I think, one of the most wonderful things in all chamber music, and he unhooks the violin from the piano, and effectively the entire exposition of the piece is taken by the piano by itself, jumping between all the parts, the kind of mercurial mobility that Ravel loves to exploit in the duo we're going to be playing. And the violin is left basically to play, very simple idea, really a melodic line that starts at the bottom of the instrument and slowly works its way up to the top of the instrument to the end. So the violin is put into its home territory for the end of the movement, whereas at the beginning it is having to work very hard to be in dialogue with the piano. And of course it's largely piano material that's dominating the way that exposition works. Where I've given you there figure 10 at the top, the recapitulation itself happens at 11. So the piano begins the melody that is handed over to the violin. There's a little bit of a lead into this as well. very sorry to do that. It's such a wonderful piece of playing. I need to say something important. There's a critical piece of information to put in play now. It's very clear as we listen to that the instruments aren't really in dialogue with one another. That this metaphor of dialogue that we use is it's a fine, there's nothing wrong. It's a useful metaphor often, but the next section of this talk I have it all in my head under a heading that will appear in a little while, and I'm a bit apologetic for it because I can't think of a better language. But what's going on here is a kind of meta-dialogue. It's a dialogue at one level, and at another level it's something altogether different. And in a way we're also going to look, in Ravel's case, at the idea that these instrumental pairings somehow become a kind of meta-instrument. That you're listening at that moment to, well, people almost as if they're in two time spaces. But that's the idea probably Ravel had first. If I'm guessing where a composer begins, he begins there, imagines this, and then works backwards and thinks, how do I arrive there? The challenge for Ravel in this duo is rather different, as although the two instruments are fundamentally homogeneous, at least we have the same kind of thing, it's easier for us to be in dialogue. They're subsets of an initially large family that, it's worth remembering, included a smaller violin, alto and tenor violas, and of course a real bass, which this isn't. They're also drastically different from one another, and it's exactly this paradox that Ravel exploits. We're the same thing and we're not the same thing. And it's very interesting to me that in all of her writing about this piece, Hélène Jourdan-Morange refers to these instruments as tenors and basses. She never refers to the violin as a treble instrument. I'm going to hand over to Peter in just a moment, but it seems relatively common today to assume that a duo for violin and cello is something quite special. Heyde had written one just a few years before this, about 1914, 1915. It hadn't yet been published, but everyone seems to assume that Ravel had heard it. I'm not quite sure how. But if we go looking, there are at least 400 published examples from the late 18th century into the early 19th century, with Pleyel and Reicher making particularly important contributions, and there are major pieces by virtuosi. The Belgian cellist Skærved wrote one duo with Léonard and another with Vieuxtemps. So this is hardly something new, and I think this might be a good point to start building a perspective.
Yeah, it might seem a little perverse that we've introduced the subject of Anton Reicher into talking about Ravel, and in many ways Neil and I come at French music from completely separate fascinations. This movement behind you is the last movement of, I think it's number 5 from the cycle of 12 duos.
Number 9.
Number 9, I always get that wrong. An extraordinary set of duos, which it's unclear when they're written, and I'm not going to talk about that so much, because I'm just going to really offer in many ways a sidebar to what Neil is going to talk about. This set was published undated. I like to think that, judging by its style, it probably dates from Reicher's first unsuccessful sojourn in Paris from 1799, just before he went back to work alongside Beethoven in Vienna, which resulted in his unbelievably good Opus 48 and 49 quartets, which Beethoven got published for him. So I'm going to do a little intermezzo before we get back to the meat of what Neil is going to talk about. Now, this duo, for me, shines a modest light onto how the fascinations of late 18th century French music idealists and innovators would wind their way through the next 100 years, providing two things: a model, and secondly, I'd like to put this out there, almost a typology, a way that you could riff back on things without knowing that you were doing it. So I'm going to make two very modest suggestions. The first is what Neil is beginning to talk about, the idea of the two instruments melded into each other. He's going to use the word meta-instrument later, I'm just going to say that, because we couldn't find a better word for it. Two instruments where sometimes you can't tell who's doing what. Actually harks back to something which there was a lot of excitement about in France at the end of the 18th and early 19th century. That's the idea of a primal musical instrument. Now, in Ravel's sonata, this seems to leave kind of musical traces. There's, in the first movement in particular, a constant folding back to the open strings. Often I'll end a gesture and you'll get a little Now, that might not seem much, but in terms of the language of how music was being talked about just before and after the French Revolution, this takes us back to the idea of a protoplastic instrument, like protoplastic languages were being played with, the idea of even the revival of the idea of the primal hut, one of the most ridiculous ideas, but actually which gave us, because of the publication of Logier's a treatise in 1775, everyone got excited about it. And in 1780, Benjamin Laborde, in his Essai sur la musique, which is groundbreaking and fanciful at the same time, acknowledged that the violin's origins, and this is where it gets exciting, was so obscure that, quote, to know so little is to know nothing. However, this didn't prevent burgeoning speculation from composers and from musicians and from makers as to what the ideal archaic form for a stringed instrument would be like. Of course, one of the primal forms, if you like, the most natural form, is what's behind us, is the notion of the Aeolian harp, where, if Coleridge would put it, where the breeze warbles and the mute still air is music slumbering on her instrument. This is the Aeolian harp movement, which we might play a little bit of in a minute, well, in context of what you're talking about. The most natural thing. In Virgil, it's sitting in a tree after a battle, so literally the winds can play homage to the gods. In France, of course, musicians took this fascination to quite some extreme with their obsession with Ossian. Pierre Baillot, one of in many ways, the initiator of the first method, actually quoted Ossian in the 1801 method, bewailing the fact that the modern musician was no longer the bard of the Middle Ages. Then he goes into True Macpherson, quote, pouring the sweet melody of his songs over the agitated soul of heroes as a refreshing dew. So I'm going to leave that, put that nuisance idea out there of this going back and looking at the old instrument, the imaginary old instrument, in the same way that Logier begins his treatise on architecture with this picture of a woman sitting on classical ruins, pointing back at the primal hut, saying, "Et voilà l'homme loge, there is where man should live." My second modest idea concerns Ravel's stripped-down two-part language. For all of its complexity, there's remarkably little double stopping in this work, and there's actually no contrapuntal of double stopping at all. There's no point where we're playing in four parts. That trick is not played, although it is a virtuoso piece, no doubt. Now, this references, and I have to keep going back to this, consciously or not, the idealization and even the idealization of two-part textures round about the time of the French Revolution in Paris. Now, of course, the simple idea had its roots in the craze for Rousseau, whose music was widely played. Let's not forget that Beethoven arranged two Rousseau movements, and Rousseau himself published versions of primal music. And I'm going to play a very short bit of one of those in a minute, an example of it. Rousseau had advocated the sublime science of simple minds, and his fellow composer admirer Grétry expressed how this sublime science might offer ideals for melody. If there is too much learning in music and too many complications in the accompanying parts, the melody, which is the main part of this art, is destroyed. I would much prefer unaccompanied song, if it is good, to song accompanied by many orchestral parts that smother it and make me search for it as a diamond lost in the brushwood. And anybody who remembers the first critical review of Beethoven's Opus 18 sonatas will recognize this language. Now, the composer who most represented this idealized simplicity and was celebrated for it was Giovanni Battista Viotti. And the most obvious example of that, which most people have never heard, is, I'll give you 50 seconds of it. which is his Raz de Vache, which was published out of his control while he was in exile from Paris and London. Now, if you look at the bulk of Viotti's output, for all of his 23 concertos, most of his output is in 2 parts, and 2 parts only. Duo after duo or duo. Viotti was writing in what was perceived as the modern style. Even his one surviving unaccompanied sonata, the manuscript of which is in the library at the Royal Academy of Music, is in 2 parts. And in this he was not alone. Many of the solo works by his French-based violin contemporaries, Lorenzetti, Bruni, and Michel Voldemar, who's a particular favourite of mine, are in 2 parts, following the example set by their teacher or their inspiration, Tartini. And this is where we get back to Chris and Paul's talk, who of course was putting into practice his discovery that close 2-part writing will produce low resultant tones. And his 30 unaccompanied sonatas, none of which have a movement which ends with any major or minor chord at all, is based entirely on this idea. I would like to suggest that in many ways Ravel is not interested in a work for 2 instruments, but wittingly or not, is reviving this concern with a single instrument in 2 parts. Now, duo playing was fundamental to the new, I can't not call it revolutionary pedagogy. Nowhere was this more the case than the extraordinary scale accompaniments which Cherubini wrote for Baio's Art of the Violin, and also this was in the original method. Cherubini wrote 36 accompaniments for a second string player. Baio reprinted them, quote, as bass lines in the treble clef to facilitate their performance on the violin. Cherubini's adventurous accompaniments bear a lot of similarities to the brilliant 2-part writing of Riker, and of course he first met Riker in 1799 when Riker had his first disastrous visit to Paris, and of course they effectively became what Mendelssohn would later call the dried up chrysalises of the Paris Conservatoire when he visited. Of course, the foundation for this, to do dry history before I take you back to Neil, is the commission that was set up on the 3rd of April 1801. 10 people got together to talk about and to commission the first violin methods of the Conservatoire. Then 9 more methods were commissioned for various instruments, and Baio collaborated on 2 for the cello with Levasseur and Baudieu. The piano method was supplied by Jean-Louis Adam, and in the next decade, the first Empress's cellist, Empress Josephine's cellist, Dupont, who was appointed a professor in 1813, contributed to this mass of technical material coming out of the Conservatoire with his essay sur le droit et la conduite de l'archer avec une suite d'exercices. So, how was this viewed from outside? In 1824, the view from London was not that impressed. It forms a part of the plan of the French Conservatory to inculcate the philosophy of art, together with the practice, and though the maxims introduced into their books are few, brief, and sketchy, yet they can hardly fail to impel the student to use his understanding as well as his fingers. And at the same time that these observations set him a thinking, they will teach him to form high and honourable notions. Baio provided numerous examples of such philosophy and maxims scattered across his teaching methods, invoking the ancients to back up his musical arguments, including Aristotle, Plutarch, Aristides, and Euclid, who was being talked about earlier today. So, I would just like to suggest, before we go back to Neil, that Ravel's sonata is a long-term outcome which the founding fathers of the Conservatoire would have been well pleased with. Much of its economy of means, its clarity of idea and ideal, are precisely what the revolutionary generation had imagined, and I think they would recognise it as being theirs. So, back to Neil.
Should we play a tiny bit of VA?
Yes, let's do that. So this is the, well, we won't describe what it does because you can see what it does. This is the Aeolian harp. And you can see we never play together. It's to be anachronistic, it's a hocket.
The question is whether it feels like one instrument, which of course it doesn't. And I think it's the it's the paradox that it's two instruments pretending to be one instrument who don't sound like one instrument. In fact, a pianist who heard us play this the other day said, it almost sounds like a pianist playing one part as if they're trying to make it two. This play between the meta-dialogue, the meta-instrument, is of course most explicitly written about in relation to the string quartet. John Irving cites that very famous letter from Goethe to Zelter, where he says, whenever I was in Berlin, I would seldom miss Meuser's quartet evenings. For me, such artistic presentations were always the most intelligible forum for appreciating instrumental music, in which one heard four reasonable people conversing, as it were. And I think that's often left out of people's quotations of that letter. Conversing, believed their discourse to be profitable and became acquainted with the individuality of the instruments. This way of describing the quartet has always seemed to me a curious concatenation of divergent ways of thinking about music and performance. We're not unpicking the relationship between the instruments and the players, which is clearly important also. But the critical element for today is that what he's describing is a complex relationship between the encompassing whole, the thing he describes as the conversation, and the individuality of the instruments. And if I had time, I would have said the Ravel we're going to look at in the context of Second Viennese School string quartets, which pick up this idea much more explicitly than any of the repertoire from the 19th century. You can see them very particularly taking up this game of corporate versus individual and playing it out. And the Lyric Suite and Schoenberg's Third Quartet both play that out in ways that directly connect to a programmatic frame that they had in place. But no time. Ravel handles the meta-dialogue, if I'm going to call it that. I still feel apologetic, so just bear with it. In ways that look very traditional at the beginning of this piece. In fact, in ways that look like normal dialogue. The very beginning of the first movement is typically, well, there's an ostinato, I play a tune, then the violin plays a tune. It really is, my turn, your turn, at one level. But the crossing over of colors in this first statement, the particular way in which the harmonic interaction of the instrument works, actually points to a completely different conception of how the two instruments make a sound. And in fact, you'll see also the layout of the parts. This is an extraordinary piece of musical printing to print the violin part, in this case, below the cello part. It sets for the violinist, at the beginning, it looks so obvious that you would write it like this. But of course, by the time you get to figure one, it's not so obvious you would write it like that. And I don't know of another piece that is notated like that. Certainly not another piece from as early as 1922. So even the notations, and my part is of course the other way around, cello part large, violin part above it. But I think that's encouraging us to play with a relationship that is not what it first appears to be. Let's play the beginning. Right.
This beginning is great. Easy for violins, really hard for cellists. Love it.
Yeah, this is Ravel being demonic. Etc. You can see It was very obvious as a player that he's working his way around the open strings. We begin A, E, we then gradually add in the D, we then add in the G. By the time we get to the end, we're already beginning to have the C. This is a piece of music that is built just as explicitly as Paul's piece is built around a set of oboe multiphonics. This is a piece built around the strings of the instrument, the naked instrument, if you like. And one of the challenges at the beginning is that the cello is a harmonic there. And of course, you need to get your finger down eventually, which is a very awkward way to begin the piece.
And the fact that the harmonic is slightly flat.
The harmonic is quite seriously flat. Yeah.
Use them, what do I do? Do I plot for it or home?
If I play my A with yours.
I'm going to try to. I'm going to mute.
But the harmonic you can hear is flat, only a few cents flat. But later he uses that harmonic, which is a third of a tone flat, and expects the players to organize their tuning around that to find a way of ending, because he puts that A underneath it, and then
do I have to play that?
Yeah, you realize how far off the actual open string of the instrument we are. So it's clear it's a kind of one instrument, two instrument game. Vaughan Williams described Ravel teaching him to orchestrate in points of color rather than lines. And that's what the open strings are through this piece, a set of points of color around which the material is organized. The meta instrument, if I can call it that, is even more obvious by the time we're at the beginning of the second instrument. I noticed that Stephen Zank's book on Ravel even describes this movement as a meta instrument at the beginning. So it made me feel a little bit less bad for using this slightly ugly language.
And this is the Debussy thing, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Into a dialogue, but it's very clear that the beginning of the piece is one line across the two, then the line begins to open out, and then we start to play a game where what's initially one instrument very clearly becomes two, and then we move into something that really is a kind of dialogue. Can we pick it up from his clown episode?
Yep.
Where?
Figure 7.
Yes, I'm in the wrong page. That is. Okay. Do you want to play just before it?
Yeah.
We start to play a game where each of us are quickly hopping. It's the mercurial mobility of hopping between parts. And many people have described the writing here and in the last movement as being a veritable quartet. But the movement really breaks down towards the end. And in fact, what I really want to point out here is that Ravel's game is to try and exploit every part of the relationship between these two instruments, where we're as if we're one instrument, where we're playing it being multiple instruments, and then where he pulls us as far apart from one another as you possibly could. which is where this movement ends. Should we just pick it up from 17?
Yep.
Two places where both are, there's no way the other player can get into that territory. At this point, you're pushed to absolute extremes. Dialogue of any kind is impossible here. And this is a sort of elemental cello, you know, across the strings.
And he can't do it.
Yeah. That sound doesn't actually exist on the cello. Although we'd like to see the violin go. Not quite the same, is it? Okay. Where am I? I'm going to cut out a little bit of material. If we went back to the first movement, I'll leave this for you to hear in the concert this evening, because whereas in the violin and piano sonata, we saw in the recapitulation the moment in which you know what the idea of the sonata was. In the recapitulation of the first movement of this piece, it comes with the violin, or maybe we should play a tiny bit of it just so we hear. The violin is playing effectively all of the open strings underneath the cello. So the ostinato, the backdoor entry to the piece through the Debussy quote, is now gone. And what we have instead is open strings from the violin and then a much richer set of open strings from the cello.
Open strings plus C, plus your open
plus my open strings, exactly.
The only time I play the opening figure of is just at the very end of that on the back foot hidden. It's the only time it ever comes back, the opening figure.
One more perspective we need, just briefly. This is, well, from the English translation of Duport's essay to which Peter alluded earlier. Ravel seems to have been incredibly aware of the kind of harmonic resonance that comes from the instrument. And if I just read you the introduction to this chapter, which is not what you have in front of you there, this is originally 1806, and Duport writes, "The subject of this chapter is, I fear, beyond my powers, for, in order to treat it fully, a knowledge of natural philosophy and mathematics is required, while I simply understand music. But so thoroughly convinced am I that an acquaintance with the relation existing between the vibrations is necessary for obtaining a true intonation and producing a pure tone, that's the critical bit, that I shall state what I've learned through a long familiarity with the four strings of the cello and endeavour to demonstrate, or rather to make evident to anyone who may place his fingers on that instrument, whether the sounds he produces are true or false. And one of the examples he gives, and Ravel's keenly aware of this, I don't know whether you would have noticed as we played, but we begin with open string material, and then suddenly he throws in chromatic notes. And the whole piece is structured around open string pillars and chromatic interludes. And coloristically, those are completely different things. You can use a kind of wide vibrato on the chromatic material. In fact, the instrument wants you to do that, otherwise those notes don't sound as strong as the others. So you build in a kind of expressive form that comes from the material itself. One of Duport's examples is he shows an E-flat scale, and what he does is, rather than the violinists who are always talking about difference tones you get from playing two notes together, he says, well, if you play this E-flat scale, you will hear that three of those notes are much stronger than the other. The E-flat has, I mean, it rings somewhat in a room like this, but it has no resonance in the instrument against it. Neither does the A. But the G, there are all sorts of things. You can actually see and feel those on the instrument. The A-flat, nothing. You can hear that. That sounds particularly dead. And then, but then the C. That's another ringing one. The strongest of them all. There's lots of ringing. And then lastly, nothing. And it's interesting that there in 1806, he's saying that's the fundamental quality of this thing. That's what a cello is. It's what a cello does. It's where you find out the proper sound from it. And it seems to me that that's what Ravel has built.
I can't help brief bracket reminding us that Viotti organised Duport's first great concert in Paris by organising for him to humiliate the English cellist Crosdell. It's a wonderful story of a wonderful denouement in a concert. You should look it up. It's wonderful. Crosdell was finished in Paris as a result of this.
Just to finish, we're very lucky that Jourdan Morange has left for posterity a précis of the advice Ravel gave to her and Maréchal as they worked with him, page by page, on a piece that her description is, it spilled a lot of ink. It's abundantly clear that one of Ravel's prime concerns, both in the compositional act but in coaching them as performers, was that he wanted to be able to bring together these two very different kinds of sonority. He clearly spent a lot of time explaining that the cello's arabesques in the first movement are not accompaniment, but the pillars of the edifice. But he also noted that the violin needs to be careful at the beginning to accompany the cello, as it tends to sound louder than the cello in that register, even in piano. Much of the material that Jourdan Morange reports is the kind of metaphor typical of most rehearsal talk. The crescendo of the first movement is described as an increase of heat, the recapitulation, a return to the linear curve of a little story, a quasi-lullaby. The second movement has a clownesque improvisation. The third is an immense paroxysm of desperation, followed by a dream passage. Jourdan Morange describes a tiger and a big lion. There's a lot of metaphor. In the last movement, Ravel describes the cello's bow, this as a mechanical rabbit.
Which is something that Rachmaninoff clearly loved as well.
Yeah, yes, exactly, yes. Despite these comments, simultaneously playful and serious, it's remarkable that the chapter that discusses working closely with Ravel in Jourdan Morange's book, Ravel et Nu, opens with the kind of observation that performers often make today in relation to Ravel's music, perhaps without realizing that it has a very long history. She writes here, I know that each performer must make a personal contribution to the interpretation of a masterpiece, but Ravel's music is a great exception. As Vuillermoz has aptly written, there are many ways of executing Debussy, but there is only one way of playing Ravel. And those words are interestingly chosen against the way we'd normally expect them to be found in that quotation. Ravel's music is so perfectly completed that the least nudge of the needle would disturb the complete mechanism of the watch. Marguerite Long, Another of Ravel's long-term collaborators adopts a similar strategy near the beginning of her chapter that deals with performing Ravel at the piano with Ravel. She quotes Ravel himself, "I do not ask for my music to be interpreted, but only for it to be played." Long, hardly a shy violet, spends some time unpicking the challenge. Of course she knows she's important. But for today, it will have to be enough to recall a fingering that I didn't point out when we had the beginning of the piece up with the violin part. But the fingering on the copy that I took off IMSLP to save scanning is in a way a typical early 20th century fingering to avoid all the open string resonances of the instrument. That's the fingering that happens to be out there in a part that's in the public domain. That is somebody interpreting. That's trying to reach for a particular kind of colour. You could even go as far as to say it's something that plasters makeup over the resonance of the instrument, if we get back to Jourdan Morange's first metaphor. Marguerite Long could have begun with another story in which she recounts a contretemps between Ravel and Wittgenstein over the left-hand concerto, following which Wittgenstein wrote to Ravel, "Performers must not be slaves," and Ravel replied, "Performers are slaves." But slaves to whom or slaves to what? Perhaps Ravel knew how to love and expected his players to know how to love, as Nathan Milstein only quasi-playfully claimed to do, the violin more than music. Is the composer not also a slave? And we'll leave it there.